On the night of July 2nd, 1994, a young man walked out of a nightclub in Medellín, Colombia, got into an argument, and was shot 12 times. The man who pulled the trigger allegedly shouted the word "Colombian scream" when a goal is scored, with each bullet he fired. The victim was Andrés Escobar, one of the most beloved footballers in Colombian history, a man so gentle and so principled that his teammates called him El Caballero, the gentleman, and a man whose only crime, if you could even call it that, was accidentally kicking a ball into his own net 10 days earlier at the World Cup in the United States. He was 33 years old. He had a fiancée. He had his entire life ahead of him. And he was murdered on a pavement outside a nightclub because of a football match.
Andrés Escobar, jugador de la selección Colombia, fue cobardemente asesinado en Medellín.
It was at 3:30 a.m. in front of this restaurant. 27-year-old Andrés Escobar got into his car. He was surrounded and shot 12 times.
Los asesinos, después de cada disparo, lo insultaban y le gritaban "golazo".
Here at Goalline Stories, where we tell the stories that go far beyond the score lines, we ask you to subscribe if you haven't already, because what we are about to tell you is not just a football story. It is a story about what happens when the most powerful criminal organization in the world decides that football belongs to them, and what happens to the people who get caught in between. This is the story of Andrés Escobar, a man who deserved to be remembered as a hero, and who was instead taken from the world in the most senseless and devastating way that football has ever witnessed. To understand why Andrés Escobar's death sent shockwaves not just through Colombia, but through the entire football world, you first need to understand what Colombia meant to football in the early 1990s, and what football meant to Colombia during one of the darkest periods in the country's history. This was a nation that had been held hostage for over a decade by the most powerful and most violent drug cartel the world had ever seen, the Medellín cartel, led by a man named Pablo Escobar, who shared a surname with Andrés, but absolutely nothing else. Pablo Escobar had turned Colombia into a war zone, assassinating politicians, judges, police officers, and journalists who dared to stand in his way, and reducing entire communities to a state of terror so complete that ordinary Colombians had almost forgotten what it felt like to be proud of their country. And then, in the middle of all of this darkness, something extraordinary happened. The Colombian national football team began to play some of the most breathtaking, joyful, and electrifying football that South America had ever produced. Under their coach, Francisco Maturana, Colombia had assembled a generation of players so talented and so expressive that the great Pelé himself had predicted they would win the 1994 World Cup. And for millions of Colombians who had lived through nothing but violence and despair, that prediction felt like the first real reason to hope that they had been given in a very long time. But there was a darker and far more sinister dimension to Colombian football's rise that most of the world either didn't know about or chose not to look at too closely. And it was a dimension that would ultimately prove fatal for Andrés Escobar. The Colombian football clubs of the 1980s and early 1990s were swimming in drug money. Cartel money that had been laundered through football clubs the way other criminals laundered money through restaurants and construction companies, except that the cartels didn't just want to clean their cash, they wanted to own the sport completely. Pablo Escobar himself had deep ties to Atlético Nacional, one of Colombia's biggest clubs, and other cartel figures controlled other teams across the country, which meant that Colombian football existed in a permanent state of terror where referees were threatened, results were manipulated, and the people who ran the game lived in genuine fear of the consequences of making the wrong decision. The players themselves existed in an impossible position. They were the public face of a sport that had been quietly colonized by organized crime. And the one thing that protected them, as long as they were winning and making their powerful backers happy, was their value as entertainers and symbols of national pride. Andrés Escobar understood this world better than most because he had grown up inside it, and yet he had somehow managed to maintain a dignity and a decency that set him apart from everything around him, becoming the conscience of a team that desperately needed one. The 1994 World Cup in the United States began for Colombia with the weight of an entire nation's expectations on their shoulders. And the pressure was not just the ordinary pressure that comes with representing your country on the biggest stage in football. It was something far heavier and far more dangerous than that, because the people who had invested millions of cartel dollars into Colombian football were watching every match with a very different kind of interest than the ordinary fan. Colombia had been drawn into a group with Romania, Switzerland, and the United States. And before the tournament began, the consensus among football's most respected observers was that Colombia would cruise through the group stage and announce themselves as genuine contenders for the title. What happened instead was a catastrophe so sudden and so complete that it still feels almost impossible to explain, even 30 years later. In their opening match against Romania, Colombia were beaten 3-1 in a performance so far below what anyone had expected that the shock reverberated through the entire football world. The pressure that descended on the squad after that defeat was unlike anything most of them had ever experienced, and it came not just from the media and the fans, but from sources far more frightening than either. There were credible reports that cartel figures had begun making threats against players and their families, that the phone lines into the team hotel were running hot with warnings that failure would not be tolerated, and that some players were so genuinely terrified that they could barely sleep at night. It was in this atmosphere of fear and desperation that Colombia faced the United States in their second group match on June 22, 1994, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. And it was in this match that the moment occurred that would cost Andrés Escobar his life. In the 35th minute, with the score level and Colombia desperately needing a result to keep their World Cup alive, an American midfielder named John Harkes played a low cross into the Colombian penalty area, and Andrés Escobar, attempting to intercept it and clear the danger, instead redirected the ball with his left foot into his own net, in a movement so instinctive and so unfortunate that it was over before he even had time to process what had happened. He stood in the penalty area for a moment with his hands on his head, staring at the ground. And then he looked up and got on with the game, because that is what Andrés Escobar did. He was a professional, a leader, and a man who understood that the only response to a mistake was to keep going. Colombia lost the match 2-1, were eliminated from the World Cup, and flew home to a country where the mood had shifted from hope to fury, with a speed that was genuinely frightening. Andrés Escobar, to his eternal credit, did not hide. He returned to Medellín. He went out with friends. He lived his life openly and without apology, because he believed, as any reasonable person would, that an own goal at a football tournament was a mistake, not a crime. 10 days after that own goal, on the night of July 2, 1994, Andrés Escobar went out to a nightclub in Medellín called El Indio with a group of friends because he was a young man who had made a mistake at a football tournament and who had absolutely no reason to believe that mistake would cost him anything more than the pain of elimination and the temporary disappointment of a nation that would, in time, move on, as nations always do. What happened in the early hours of that morning has been pieced together from witness accounts and court records, and what those accounts describe is an argument that began in the car park outside the club. An argument that escalated with a speed and a violence that left bystanders frozen in shock, and then 12 gunshots that ended the life of one of the most decent human beings that Colombian football had ever produced. The man convicted of pulling the trigger was a bodyguard who worked for a cartel-connected family. And while the full truth of who ordered the killing and why has never been completely and officially established, the message that those 12 bullets sent to Colombian football and to the wider world was unmistakably clear: that in Colombia in 1994, the line between football and organized crime was so thin as to be almost invisible, and that the consequences of crossing the wrong people, even accidentally, even innocently, could be fatal. Andrés Escobar was buried in Medellín on July 4, 1994, and an estimated 120,000 people lined the streets to say goodbye to a man who had represented everything good and everything hopeful about Colombian football at a time when the country desperately needed both. He was not buried as a man who scored an own goal. He was buried as a hero, as El Caballero, as the gentleman who had played the game with grace and dignity, and paid for it with his life. Colombia has never quite recovered from losing him, and the football world has never quite forgotten what his story represents. A brutal and devastating reminder that football, for all its beauty and all its power to unite and inspire, exists in the real world, a world where the stakes can sometimes be higher than any scoreline, and where the most innocent of mistakes can carry consequences that no sport should ever be able to impose on a human being. If this story moved you, and if you believe that football's greatest stories are the ones that remind us of our shared humanity, then Goalline Stories is exactly where you belong. We tell these stories every single week, going beyond the goals and the glory to find the moments that truly matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now, because it costs you nothing and means everything to us. This has been Goalline Stories, and we will see you in the next chapter.